Rain needles the eyes and tastes of tin as the bridge watch on USS Rasher braces into the wind off the Kuroshio. It is 2300 hours on August 18th, 1944, a night that would have encouraged superstition in a less technical age. Black squalls trundling like walls, thunder stepping the horizon, the sea glazed with shredded foam. The SJ surface search radar pings and blooms, ghosts at first, then a bright, steady return that holds too firm to be weather. Down the track aboard Taiyo, a signalman cinches his oilskin and trusts the storm. He is not a fool. He has simply misread the century. Rasher's bridge smells of diesel and wet wool. Men move by touch. The blackout is complete. In the control room, a fire controlman, young for the weight of the job, reads the rate from radar and repeats it flat, disciplined. The boat's heart is the bronze waist of the torpedo data computer, gearing angles on the bow and target speed into gyro settings for 10 21-inch tubes. An enlisted man steadies a pencil against the ship's shiver and draws the arc of an intercept. How we arrived at this moment carries its own electricity. On the 7th of December 1941, the United States committed to unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. The early patrols would have broken lesser sailors, Mark 14 torpedoes running too deep, magnetic exploders that pre-detonated, contact pistols that kissed and quit. In 1943 at Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood demanded the truth and ordered live fire tests that shamed proud bureaus but fixed the weapons. Now the silent service hunts as strangler rather than scout, favouring tankers because fuel decides strategy long after torpedo wakes go flat. The signalman on Taiyo would have tried to read through rain and virtue. He would have believed in the decisive battle the way a farmer believes in a season. The altar had moved. The new catechism ran, close at night on the surface, trust radar, feed the TDC clean numbers, and spend torpedoes freely. Stores at Pearl and Fremantle would replace them. Range, the captain asks. 8,000 yards and closing, the radar operator answers, knuckles white where they touch the console. The navigator sketches the convoy's likely track, west toward Luzon, then for Formosa. Escorts forced wide by weather are losing the geometry that makes a screen a screen. 1 minute the scope shows marbles, the next it shows pattern, weakness given shape. The captain murmurs the ritual, steady up, let the figures finish, while the boat settles onto attack course. This storm is recorded. Logs record squalls and typhoon warnings along this route. And the arithmetic is simple. When tankers burn, fighter pilots downrange fly fewer hours next month, ships with sacred names remain tied to piers for want of bunker fuel. It is a decision about calendars, which airfields will go silent, which plans will miss their moment because the fuel to animate them is about to become fire on water. At 23:09 he speaks, "Stand by forward. Open outer doors." The reply comes back tinny through the voice tube, a sound every submariner would recognize in his sleep. The plotting table holds the elegance of chalk. Shoot. Steel leaves steel. The hull shudders as if relieved to be rid of the burden. Out there a shape changes, a flare lifts, a new light that is not lightning finds the clouds' underbellies. The signalman on Taiyo looks up too late and thinks, absurdly, of sunlight on a rice paddy he has not seen in years. Tonight is one night, one approach. It is also a hinge of a war that will not be decided in a single thunderclap of fleets, but in lanes left empty, fuel that never arrives, tonnage graphs sloping like falling hearts. The silent service comprises scarcely 2% of Navy personnel, yet before this is over, it will account for the majority share of Japan's shipping losses. That statistic reads like a magician's lie until you taste this rain and feel, with Rasher's men, that abundance can be a doctrine. The sea hisses. Rasher settles, listening for screws that change cadence, for escort propellers that dig their heels into the water. Somewhere astern, the pencil draws a parallel track, so there will be another shot if geometry gifts them one. The storm closes like a curtain. The chapter the enemy expected, decisive battle upon decisive battle, has been torn from the book and fed to the sea. The men stand their stations. The radar keeps time like a metronome. And in the dark, industry breathes through copper wires and gyros, telling a boat in a storm exactly how to change a nation's future. In a windowless room off the Pearl Harbor piers, a chart lies wounded by pencil stabs. Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood studies the stack of patrol reports that say the same hateful thing. Excellent approach, perfect angle, heavy thud, no kill. If the Bureau of Ordnance can't give us torpedoes that hit and explode, he tells the room in 1943, then get the Bureau of Ships to design a boat hook and we'll rip the plates off. The line is theatre, the fury is engineering. He wants proof. The Mark 14 was supposed to be a thoroughbred, steam-driven, 21 inches wide, designed to run deep with a magnetic influence exploder that would trigger beneath a keel. Instead, it ran too deep, the magnetic feature pre-detonated, and the contact pistol sometimes struck square and failed. Skippers came home doubting their own nerve. Some fired at anchored hulks to be sure their eyes weren't lying. You cannot build doctrine on maybes. Lockwood orders live-fire tests that had seemed heresy. Boats fire into sea cliffs, practice heads are pulled and warheads used, stopwatches and sextants come out like surgical tools. The data is merciless. Depth-keeping is wrong by whole men, not inches. The magnetic pistol is tripped by the vagaries of the earth. A perfect zero-angle hit can crush the contact pistol's nose. Exploders come apart on benches. Machinists file and shim. Officers rewrite standing orders. The change in the boats is spiritual as well as mechanical. Word spreads that the fish will explode. Skippers stop husbanding torpedoes like family heirlooms and start spending them like ammunition. They close at night on the surface because radar beats the moon. The torpedo data computer, the bronze waist of gears and cams, ticks like a metronome while the SJ scope holds a target steady in rain. In wardrooms, the talk turns to hunting. Lanes, tides, choke points, and always tankers first. Numbers will later read like a legend, roughly 14,700 torpedoes fired by American submarines in the Pacific. But to the men in 1943, the only number that matters is one. The next fish hits and explodes. Doctrine follows evidence. Patrol orders whisper tonnage. Boats are told to haunt the Luzon Strait, to work the South China Sea, to dare the Bungo and La Perouse funnels when traffic promises feast. Fuel becomes the prize, and skippers learn to set spreads deep to break a tanker's back under the sloshing load. Radar, SJ on the bridge, turns weather into cover. Rain that once cancelled a hunt now scatters the screen and hides the attacker. Another weapon arrives by crate, the Mark 18 electric. It hisses instead of smoking and leaves no white wake. Crews love its stealth and fear its vice, a potential circular run. They learn to track every shot until the ocean swallows the trace and to respect the shadow that stealth casts on the shooter. With honest weapons, the service restores its character. Before, a commanding officer might break off an approach rather than throw good steel after bad. After, he presses and fires again because he trusts the math and the metallurgy. Wolf packs form by plan and appetite. Boats coordinate by prearranged pattern and prowl the same lanes an hour apart. Convoys that once sailed like beads on a string become knots seeking scissors. Japan's belated response creates a combined escort command in November 1943. It will save some ships. It will not save the idea that a single decisive fleet action can redeem lost months. Facts remain. Gato and Balao class fleet boats carry 10 21-inch tubes, test to 300 or 400 feet, and use that depth to ride out angry patterns of depth charges after night attacks. Men memorize the underwater acoustics of survival, how a destroyer's screws sound at 30 knots, how a pattern feels in the ribs of the hull. They eat hurriedly, sleep in slices, and learn to love clean angles and quiet trim. By autumn 1943, the curve on Lockwood's wall bends upward. Sinkings increase, and with them the figure no staff officer can pad. Delivered fuel begins to fall. Lectures still speak of a decisive battle, but the ships that might make it possible are dying in the margins of reports. A simple sentence in a patrol diary, fired 4, observed 2 hits, ripples through an empire's calendar. Pilots downrange will fly fewer hours next month. On a distant pier, a carrier rides at anchor like a museum piece, pointless without gasoline. And at Pearl, when a boat casts off, men touch the bronze of the TDC as if it were a saint, not from superstition, but because it represents a promise kept. The next time they find a target, the torpedoes will do their duty. Tokyo wakes to rain on the 15th of November 1943. In a narrow office in the Navy Ministry, Lieutenant Commander Hayashi Kenji straightens an empty binder stamped Route Control. The new Combined Escort Command is born this morning, 2 years after America declared unrestricted submarine warfare. Hayashi is competent, precise, and loyal. He is also late, and he knows it. He was trained to think in lines of battle, the Tsushima Echo, draw the enemy into big gun range and settle things with steel and smoke. Convoys were a necessary disorder. Ships vanish from routes that once felt regular. Reports arrive with the same passive verbs, believed sunk, presumed lost, overdue. The staff whispers new words, routing, screening, ASDIC, ping, the only way to slow the bleeding. The facts do not flinch. Japan began with roughly 6.38 million gross registered tons of merchant shipping and has already lost an intolerable share. New construction is valiant, but the graphs curve down even as yards work late. Tankers take longer to build. When one goes down, the loss echoes from Truk to training fields where pilots ration hours. Hayashi drafts an order that tries to be 3 things at once: a plan, an apology, and a promise that convoys and escorts will now be central. Across the ocean, Ruth McKenna, a Marin ship welder in Sausalito, steps under floodlights toward a half-finished T2 tanker. She is not thinking of Tokyo, but her spark throws blue light that falls into Hayashi's ledger all the same. America will launch more than 2,700 Liberty ships and hundreds of T2 tankers. Big yards will push hulls down the ways faster than the enemy can count them. If it sounds impossible that a democracy could replace its losses and strangle an empire at the same time, remember what ordinary hands can do when equipped and believed. Hayashi's telephone rings. A destroyer pressed into escort duty has thrown a shaft bearing. The spare is in Kure, the convoy at Moji cannot wait, and the submarines have been busy along the Bungo exit. He flips pages and finds the new purpose-built Kaibokan, 16 or 17 knots, stacks of depth charges, simple sonar, are still a line item rather than a presence. He asks for air cover and is told the carrier Taiyo is at sea but committed elsewhere. There are never enough aircraft or pilots. Doctrine is a kind of faith, and today his must bend. He writes, centralize routing, concentrate escorts at choke points, demand zigzag discipline. He specifies daylight air patrols over Luzon Strait and night radar pickets, if available. He reminds merchant masters that bravery is obedience to convoy orders, not lonely speed. He signs with a neat stamp and a louder hope than he feels. Outside his window, a tram squeals. The city smells of coal and cabbage. Inside, reality tallies itself without sentiment. The ocean does not care about stamps. In the Luzon Strait, the Kuroshio runs like a river, freighting ships into predictable corridors. American wolf packs, guided by routing intelligence and sharpened by Lockwood's reforms, ride those corridors. The fleet boats, Gato and Balao, 10 tubes forward and aft combined, test depths of 300 to 400 feet, prefer the night surface approach where SJ radar and a cool hand can do the work. When escorts respond with depth charge patterns, captains go deep and trust steel and silence. It is modern war's ugliest fairness. The more professionally they fight, the more swiftly mathematics starves them. From her side of the Pacific, Ruth hears the break room rumour. The silent service is scarcely 2% of Navy personnel, yet will sink the majority share of Japan's shipping. She does not know whether the line is rumour or truth, but she understands the logic. Hit the tankers and everything downstream grows quiet. She finishes her seam and chalks her initials because pride keeps the welds honest. The plate cools, the plant whistle blows, and a ship inches closer to water. At dusk in Tokyo, Hayashi reviews the day's convoy reports. 1 arrival, 2 delayed. 1 overdue, last seen near the Ryukyus. He tries to imagine the faces on those ships and cannot. Staff work makes abstractions of men. He returns to the beginning of the new manual and writes a sentence he wishes he had written 2 years earlier. Merchant shipping is a weapon system. Its destruction is decisive. He closes the binder. The rain stops. In the island, sea lanes, bows rise and fall in the dark, and men on both sides brace for a doctrine that will not forgive mistakes. Dawn comes thin and metallic over La Perouse Strait on the 11th of October 1943, a wind that bites through wool and a gunmetal sea. USS Wahoo noses toward the funnel between Hokkaido and Sakhalin, a place pilots mark as a weather line and submariners call a dare. To the west, the tide races like a river. To the east, shoal water lifts its shoulder. Mines are rumoured, patrol craft are certain, aircraft are likely. From the periscope, well, the strait looks narrow and endless at once, flanked by low cloud and shore guns. Commander Dudley Mush Morton has made this boat a legend in patrol reports, aggressive and deadly. He knows coastal traffic hugs the shore here, that a daring exit could bring him a last rake at enemy shipping before the open Pacific. The depth sounder gives nervous numbers. Charts never guarantee what the last storm moved. The favourite refuge of hunted boats is weak here. A destroyer's sonar, set properly, will hear more than offshore. A shore battery coughs, the soft throat clearing before a line of spray walks the water. The conning tower drops. At periscope depth, the world becomes a green tunnel, screws beating overhead, the thrum of a patrol craft too close for poetry, the underwater slap of near misses. The TDC waits for numbers the captain does not have time to collect. Morton takes fast looks and short risks. An aircraft shadows the lens, then the brittle clatter of small bombs. The first pattern is wide. The second is not. The boat rocks, objects lift, men swear in the way the sea accepts, and the helmsman holds level as if the wheel is a secret. Depth charges follow from a patrol craft that has smelled its chance. In shallows, a pattern does not roll down a long column of water. It slams the whole room at once. Morton edges toward the deeper side of the channel. His exec watches the trim the way a gambler watches a die. A single degree of down bubble is the difference between escape and a scrape that will announce them forever. Facts remain even when you want poetry. La Perouse is a strait, not an ocean. There is less water to hide in and more eyes to find you with. Shore batteries do not care how far a fleet boat can dive, and aircraft halve the time between detection and violence. A near pattern lifts the stern and drops it hard. Gauges jump, a light fails, the boat levels sluggishly and then steadies. Morton tries one more change of depth to see if the water will cover the hull. It will not. Another aircraft run, another thudding pattern. Somewhere forward a seam weeps, not yet a leak, just a confession that steel made in a free country is still mortal under pressure. At some point, the detail becomes rumour and the rumour becomes silence. We know batteries fired, bombs fell, and depth charges stepped closer. Later reports and the ocean's own arithmetic conclude the boat did not pass into the open. Wahoo is marked overdue and then gone. The name becomes a clean line on a memorial and an argument in wardrooms about risk and reward. The loss is not an asterisk to victory, but a pillar that holds it up. Submariners do not ask for bloodless statistics. They ask that the statistics mean something. Morton's aggressiveness will be studied and critiqued, but no one will doubt why he pressed. Traffic was there. Starvation of an enemy economy was the strategy. And a night surface approach through a narrow place had already written glory elsewhere. The sea, which cares nothing for doctrine, took the boat anyway. Back at Pearl, Lockwood reads the report that is not a report and stares at the wall where sinkings and losses both live. Men walk a little softer. The plotters sharpen their pencils. The campaign will continue with ghosts in attendance, and when another skipper edges into a funnel between land and ambition, he will hear wahoo in his own screws and remember that courage is renewable only if steel comes back from patrol. He will go anyway. Rain walls move like marching cliffs on the night of August 18th to 19th, 1944, and the sea above the Luzon Strait keeps changing its mind. USS Rasher surfs down a black swell and steadies just enough for the radar to stop blooming with lies. On the S.J. scope, a bright return holds, fat and patient, convoy. Somewhere inside that weather, the escort carrier Tayo shepherds tankers and transports. On her deck, a plane captain ties down equipment twice and calls the Storm their best pilot. He is partly right and completely wrong. American doctrine in 1944 fits this night like a key. Boats on the surface at night, eyes out and scopes in, trust electrons more than eyesight. Wolf packs meet by plan, not by chatter. Spread across shipping lanes, they trade contacts in time rather than by radio. Rasher's bridge crew speaks in clipped numbers, bearing, range, speed. The TDC sings in bronze. The captain wants a tanker first because fuel is a future, and futures are why men drown. The Storm helps and harms. Squalls erase escorts' station-keeping, turn ordered rings into ragged commas. Asdic returns degrade into rain noise. Screws beat unevenly as ships surf and wallow. Radar has its own weather sense. It ignores spikes and holds what moves like a hull. The captain notes how the convoy yawns open where it should be tight and aims there as if he is shooting a gap on a running field. Open outer doors! Forward, men who have waited all night go about their craft with practiced intimacy. The first spread runs like a rumour. A second follows because abundance is a tactic. The boat shudders and settles. Out in the squall, a flash stretches thin and tall. Then a lower, angrier light paints rain silver. Tayo takes her wound. The Storm that promised protection now magnifies confusion, turning smoke and spray into a curtain that hides the hunter, while the hunted grope for bearings. On a Japanese escort, a junior soundman tunes his set until his wrists ache. Rain hammers the deck. The screws of his own ship jump on the trace. He knows the textbook urges a cross-bearing fit, but textbooks do not teach typhoons. He tries again. Rasher's radar operator calls the convoy's new shape as escorts surge toward the wound and leave openings elsewhere. The captain slides into one and orders another set fired at a fat return that walks like a tanker. The sea answers with a shock felt in the fillings of teeth. Now it rains cordite, fuel oil and paper. The afterdeck slips. A sailor throws sand on it from a pail without being told. This is not a duel, it is arithmetic. Each hit is a month stolen from some training schedule ashore. Each tanker burning is a squadron grounded later. America's 2%, the submariners who make up only a sliver of Navy manpower, are writing the Empire's calendar with steel and circuitry. You can dislike the coldness of that sentence and still respect the mercy of ending wars by starving plans rather than men in trenches. The American boats withdraw by fuel and prudence. The escorts wake up angry and sling depth charges into black water where they imagine wolves. Patterns beat the surface. Rasher rides down into the quieter water, sets depth, and listens as the sea swallows the tantrum. A messman steadies a coffee cup for a chief who did not know his hand was shaking. At dawn, the ocean looks innocent, grey plates of water with seams of foam. The burning patches send up their own weather, a brownish column that the wind tries to unwrite. Signals fly, cutters herd stragglers. Somewhere on a destroyer bridge, a captain decides to rescue who can be rescued and save what can be saved, because a good officer does not love doctrine more than lives. He records positions and writes a list of holes in the sea. Rasher eases away on a course that promises another intercept. The men eat as the deck allows. The radar console hums like a hive. On paper, this night will one day compress to a few lines. HI-71 engaged. Taiyo sunk. Multiple transports and tankers hit. Heavy weather present. In the living, it is a smell and a knowledge. Weather favours the side with electricity to see through it, and industry to replace torpedoes without apology. By the time the storm clears, the Empire's future is already a little smaller, measured not in harbours captured, but in ships that will never arrive. Pre-dawn, 29th of June 1944, east of the Ryukyus. The sea is grease-black, the wind only a rumour. Through USS Sturgeon's periscope, a high-sided transport slides across the lens like a cliff gone wandering. Men crowd her decks and hatches. Below, compartments hold more men and stacked crates. The name is Toyama Maru, though the torpedo room does not need names to load and set depth. In the control room, a quartermaster notes the moon's rim, the set of the current, the heavy bow. The doctrine here is simple and terrible. Transports are armies in boxes. If you let them pass, they unpack into foxholes and bunkers. If you sink them, the enemy loses not only steel but months of training and plans on paper. American orders in 1944 are clear: tankers first, then troop lifts when the shot is clean. Tonight the opportunity is almost immodest. The escort geometry is loose, the sea quiet sound. Open outer doors. Forward, sailors perform the small ballet they have practiced until it is muscle memory. Caps off, settings checked, gyros aligned. The TDC ticks, bearing rate settles, track angle cleans up. The set depth goes a hair generous for a heavy ship. The spread is arranged for certainty, a line of fate at 45 knots. The first hit is a long-distance punch to the gut. The second breaks a back already questioning its own posture. Sturgeon's men feel the shock come through steel. The honest proof hated by the Bureau of Ordnance when things used to bounce. They take no joy in the roar that follows. Somewhere aboard Toyama Maru, a young soldier thinks the deck is tilting because he has lost his balance. The ocean is making decisions now. Facts we do not embroider. Contemporary accounts place the dead at roughly 5,400, an army brigade erased in minutes. If the number seems impossible, consider the ship's size, the hour, the crowding, the training level below, the speed at which cold water decides arguments. The sea does its arithmetic without malice. It simply subtracts, and the sum is quiet. On Sturgeon, the captain resists the urge to linger. Escorts have doubts and depth charges to cure them. The boat slides down and away, minding trim and speed, listening to the distant hammer of retaliation. A chief petty officer who measures compassion by what wins wars sooner sets coffee mugs 1 finger width from the edge of the mess table because a near pattern will walk them if he is careless. No one talks loudly. Several do not talk at all. To call this a victory is true and never the whole truth. It is a strategic stroke on an enemy map. It is also 1,000 small tragedies compounded by bulkheads. The men in Toyama Maru's lower decks would have been mostly young. Many would not have known the way to the weather deck by feel. Emergency lighting fails. Water takes the shortest path to everything. Veterans who survive such sinkings speak of oil on the tongue and the unstoppable narrowing of choices. On a staff table in Tokyo, the loss writes itself in ordinary ink. Hayashi reads the figure twice and then again because the eye rebels first and the mind later. He moves a reinforcement arrow and watches it come up short by thousands of men. The arriving convoy still arrives, only smaller. A plan once confident now speaks in the conditional tense. Would have, could have, might have. Back in Sausalito, Ruth finishes a seam on a T2 and hears a foreman brag that America can afford to shoot 10 torpedoes to guarantee 1 kill. She does not know whether the ratio is precisely true in that moment, but she knows the spirit is. The arsenal of a democracy has decided that abundance is a tactic. Across the war, submarines will fire roughly 14,700 torpedoes. Industry keeps the lockers full. If that sounds like waste to an enemy who cannot replace what is lost, the lesson lands all the harder. The captain of Sturgeon logs his facts: position, course, target, torpedoes fired, observed hits, explosions heard, voices afterward, then silence. He does not speculate on the human count because patrol reports are instruments, not elegies. The boat comes shallow, takes a final look, then slides west under a skin of quiet water toward the next lane, where fuel and men still cross the map like promises. Behind them, Toyama Maru's marker on charts is a small symbol. Its shadow on the war is larger than any single battle, because a brigade that never lands never fights, and an enemy who keeps losing such chances eventually runs out of tomorrow. The wall at Pearl looks like a heart monitor gone bad. Late 1944, louvered light slanting across waxed canvas, Admiral Charles Lockwood stands before curves that have stopped pretending to be anything but truth. Delivered fuel to the forward areas is sliding off the page. Merchant arrivals are fewer. The late ones carry less. HI-71 was not a miracle, he says. It was a proof of method in a war that rewards arithmetic. A briefer reads tonnage aloud in a calm voice sailors trust. The fewer ships that leave port now sail slower, hewing to zigzags and rendezvous that add days to every voyage. Those delays reduce delivered ton miles, even when a hull survives. Cargoes arrive after the calendars they were meant to animate. The Kuroshio is a conveyor belt disguised as a current, funneling convoys through the Luzon Strait like cattle into a chute. Doctrine doesn't fight water, it uses it. Across the Pacific, photographs might still show the first carrier fleet as a polished thing, decks scrubbed and rails bright. Up close, officers count drums and see the lie. Sorties imagined on chalkboards cannot be fueled on piers. Training syllabi collapse from hours into fragments. Landings grow harsh. Mishaps rise in ways that do not print in communiques. It isn't cowardice, it's subtraction. Gasoline rationed in the air becomes strategy written on the ground. Lockwood points at the familiar instruments of that subtraction. Gato and Balau hulls run long legs on the surface at night, heads out of hatches, spray in the teeth, riding like lean destroyers. SJ radar turns rain into a curtain the hunter can see through. The torpedo data computer, gears, cams and certainty, converts closing angles into fate. The Mark 14, humbled and corrected, and the Mark 18, quiet and weightless, give skippers choices that feel like abundance aboard steel tubes built for thrift. On the map, he draws boxes around funnels and straits. Luzon, Bungo, La Perouse. Boats arrive by quiet schedule, meeting in time rather than chatter, wolf packs spread like fingers across an expected track. The order remains ruthless and simple. Tankers first. Break the spine of fuel and you break the coordination of everything else. Convoys thin, air patrols shorten, fleet sorties flicker out before flags are hoisted. An empire accustomed to decisive battles discovers a deeper decision, a future that never shows up. The staff's impossible number today is cruel and unadorned. Japan began the war with roughly 6.38 million gross registered tons of merchant shipping. By the end of this year, the usable figure trends near 2.5 million, and too much of that is misallocated, damaged or held back by fear of exactly the kind of attack the silent service delivers. Even when a ship lives, delays claw away its value. Logistics becomes siege, waged by the calendar more than the cannon. In Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Hayashi opens the Combined Escort Command ledger and finds white space where arrivals should live. He can concentrate escorts. He cannot conjure cargoes. The new Kaibokan do their honest best, steam at 16 or 17 knots, throw patterns from racks stacked man tall, and listen with sonar a generation short of the threat. They race toward oil slicks and bubbles after the fact, proof that courage without capacity is a kind of prayer. A junior officer at Pearl, keen and careful, reads the JANAC wording that will one day harden into history. American submarines will account for the majority share, roughly 50+% of Japan's ship losses by tonnage. No one cheers. The room absorbs and nods, because these graphs are memorials as surely as the plaques. 52 American submarines will not come home. Victory, like depth, is measured in fathoms of sacrifice. At noon, Lockwood walks the pier. A returning crew leans in hatches like harvesters after a long cut, thin and satisfied, eyes hitched to coffee and sleep. Their patrol report will compress to clean lines, positions, bearings, spreads, observed hits, but between those lines runs a theorem simple enough to teach a boot seaman: steal fuel and you steal tomorrow. The chief of the boat snaps a young sailor's hands out of his pockets. A torpedoman hoods a lamp. Discipline guards the edge that luck cannot. If the war were a novel, this would be the quiet chapter where everyone understands the twist. The decisive battle Japan prepared for can't happen because its prerequisites are dissolving at sea. The submariners are barely 2% of Navy personnel, yet their campaign, now an industrial act as much as a tactical one, has become the slowest kind of thunder. The Kuroshio keeps its own time. The silent service now keeps Japan's. By evening, the charts are rolled and the orders are out. Boats will sit on the straits like stones in a river, invisible until their pressure is felt. A clerk sharpens pencils for tomorrow's tallies. Somewhere in the South China Sea, a tanker bows into a swell and keeps a schedule that no longer exists. The chapter ends with no explosion, only a beat of certainty. The math is winning, and the sea is helping it along. The midnight whistle at Marinship sounds like a promise kept. Ruth McKenna tucks her hair under a kerchief, shoulders a lunch pail, and steps into a world of sparks where steel becomes destiny. Floodlights turn the Sausalito yard to daylight as half a city files onto catwalks and into holds. On the berth, a T2 tanker rises like a new coast. A rigger yells, "Coming up!" and a plate floats from gantry to seam on chains that sing their own hymn. Welding has a smell, hot iron, singed canvas, the faint sweetness of cutting oil. Ruth's hand finds the puddle and walks it forward, her arc throwing blue ghosts on the bulkhead. She knows the jargon now: stringer, butt, dog, strongback, and the rhythm of this orchestra without a violin in sight. She doesn't talk politics. She talks inches. Each clean bead is a seal against the sea. Each seam is a line drawn across an ocean she will never see. Across the bay and across the continent, shipyards bloom like factories of horizon. Liberty ships come off ways in ranks that read like an exaggeration until you stand under one. More than 2,700 will be launched, their blunt bows and slab sides unglamorous and exactly right. Victory ships add hundreds more. The T2s, fast, capacious, essential, follow, a fleet of mobile wells that will feed every hungry engine in a global war. If it sounds impossible that one nation can replace what the enemy sinks, and then some, come count keels at shift change. A foreman quotes the yard record with the boast of a man who believes in stopwatches. We can launch a Liberty in weeks. Once, a crack team did it in days. Ruth grins, but measures her pride by the neatness of her bead. She knows speed is nothing without soundness. An inspector's mirror passes near. She pauses for the eye that checks for slag and porosity. When the mirror tips in approval, it feels like permission to claim a share of a distant victory. What the yard builds flows outward in a geometry of crates and timetables. Ore becomes plate, plate becomes hull, hull becomes convoy. Convoy becomes the ability to choose when and where to fight. In the Pacific, those choices translate into submarines with full torpedo rooms and forward bases stacked with spares. Skippers do not hoard shots. They spend them to guarantee kills because trains and presses and women like Ruth keep the lockers full. Abundance, in a democracy, has learned how to be a tactic. The impossible statistic here deserves to stand without adjectives. American shipyards will build more Liberty and Victory hulls during the war than Japan possessed in total merchant tonnage at the start. Add roughly 500 T2 tankers, and the scale tilts until the fulcrum snaps. It is not waste to fire 10 torpedoes at one ship if that ship is a tanker and the torpedoes can be replaced by the next convoy. It is calculation, and the enemy is learning the lesson at sea. Ruth eats from a tin lunchbox as rain freckles the deck. Men and women share stories in short, battered sentences that would pass muster in any wardroom. A brother in the Marines, a husband on a destroyer, a letter that smells like salt. A riveter laughs that the yard makes more smoke than a cruiser broadside. She hasn't seen a cruiser. She is allowed to boast anyway. In Tokyo, Hayashi's pencil hovers over another convoy schedule that cannot be met. He scribbles for more escorts, for patrol planes, for miracles. Industry answers him with silence and hard limits. A Kaiboken can only be built so fast. A pilot can only be trained so many hours on so much fuel. Every hull he protects tonight will still take longer to arrive because the escort doctrine that finally exists also slows the game. He knows he is losing to a nation that can construct time. Back in Sausalito, Ruth watches a newly finished tanker take its first indifferent sip of water. The hull shivers the way a new foal stands. The yard whistle blows again, and men with clipboards check boxes that will become numbers on a wall at Pearl. Somewhere far west, a submarine captain will decide to shoot a second spread at a target that deserves certainty. Somewhere even farther west, a Japanese planner will black out a sortie because the fuel that was supposed to arrive tonight became smoke last week. Shift ends when the clock says, not when the body agrees. Ruth wipes grit from her face and tucks a scrap of welding rod into her pocket for luck. She walks past posters that speak in fonts and vows. Work wins. She believes it now in a way she cannot explain. The chapter closes as a siren whoops for a launch, and an ocean away the silent service smiles into the dark, knowing that the home front has made extravagance into strategy. The night air in the Formosa Strait tastes of metal and spray, and USS Tang rides it like a predator that has learned every habit of its prey. It is 24th to 25th October 1944, and Commander Richard H. O'Kane is on the bridge with his stopwatch mind and hunter's patience. Targets stack on the horizon like a gift that might be a trap. The sea is black glass cut by pale combers. The sky is a lid. O'Kane runs the classic script: surface approach, speed and silhouette minimized, SJ radar feeding the TDC numbers so clean they feel like luck. The crew moves by touch and voice. Men in the forward room check settings with hands that remember more than eyes can see. The order is simple: tankers and loaded transports first. Even in the glow of impending success, the discipline is priestly. Nothing loud, nothing wasted but what needs wasting. The first attack is beautiful, and only sailors use that word for violence. Spreads run hot and straight. Hits come with that honest steel-through-steel shudder that a man can feel in his teeth. A ship lifts and breaks. Another goes black, then orange. Escorts thrash at water that refuses to give up the hunter. Tang slides under the mess and breathes again. They come up for the second act. O'Kane sees geometry in how panic reshapes a convoy, gaps where escorts should be, lines that wander, signals that contradict. He calls ranges in a voice level enough to shave with. The TDC hums its hymn. Gyros take their orders. Mark 18. Electrics wait without wakes. The crew has learned to love their silence and fear their vice. A circular run is a rumour to be guarded against. The next salvo is the sort of decision doctrine can't take for you. The shot is there. The target earns it. He orders fire, and the boat gives what it was built to give. In the silence that follows, a sound no one wants to name begins to grow, a cadence wrong for a dying ship, too steady for escaping screws. Men who have listened to the ocean long enough to know its moods feel a coldness that is not weather. A fish is coming home. What follows is recorded in official prose and remembered in breaths. The torpedo strikes Tang's stern. Steel becomes argument. Compartments go dark. Orders cut through noise. Secure, check, move. Depth tries to claim the boat. The captain and his men fight for a pocket of survivable water long enough to make choices that leave fingerprints on history. The Mumsen lung, training tool, last resort, becomes instrument and prayer. They do it the way good sailors do everything hard, by the numbers, by the book, and by courage where the book cannot follow. Men count to steady themselves. They put on hoods, bite mouthpieces, and feel for ladders that are no longer where they should be. A few at a time they step into a blackness only the lungs can argue with. Some would have thought of wives, some of saints, some of nothing at all. The sea receives every kind. O'Kane will survive to write letters no officer ever wants to write, to honour men who did their duty to the last inch. His career as hunter becomes a chapter of endurance, proof that heroism lives on both sides of the periscope. Tang's loss will be one among 52 American submarines that do not return, a statistic used with reverence because it balances the ones that sound like boasting. Every ship sunk burned lives as fuel. Every boat lost sanctified the arithmetic that ended the war sooner. A Japanese lookout, huddled on a bridge wing downwind of flames, would have watched scattered shapes turn back toward order and felt a complicated pride. His escorts answered, even if the ocean kept its secrets. He could not know that the Americans would replace torpedoes and boats faster than his nation could replace tankers. He could only do his job and make his log as neat as he could in the rain of ash. Dawn lifts on a sea quiet because so many ships are gone. The horizon line is clean again except where smoke writes its own punctuation. Survivors cling to wreckage and prayers. Signals crackle. Orders for search and depth charge patterns go out because duty remains long after hope shortens. In Pearl, a clerk will stamp Tang, overdue, and a room will grow smaller around men who keep their caps on because habit is armour. What remains is the seam where courage meets system. A single boat's tragedy nested inside a campaign that learned to make weather, current, radar and production sing in chorus. O'Kane's night becomes a story skippers tell to honour risk and to remember that the enemy of victory is not fear but pretended certainty. The chapter closes with the sea flat as a ruler and the knowledge that every sunrise from now to surrender will shine on fewer Japanese hulls. The paper in Tokyo has gone soft from handling. Early 1945, damp curling the corners, Lieutenant Commander Hayashi rubs his thumb along a column labelled Arrivals and leaves no smudge because there is so little ink to move. He has learned the cruelty of neat arithmetic. Reality rounds down. He has escorts to assign, air patrols to request, and more empty cells than orders to fill. The combined escort command has matured in process even as its subject withers. Convoys are organised with a care that would have saved thousands earlier. Zigzags are crisp, discipline better. Kaibokan run their hearts out, drop well-timed patterns, and listen hard. Their sonar thumps dutifully. But duty does not conjure speed or make a hull unsunk. The Luzon Strait remains a funnel. The South China Sea turns into a proving ground for men learning to escort too late to teach. Hayashi reads a list of ships available for routing the way a doctor reads a chart for a patient he admires and cannot heal. A tanker overdue from Mako. A cargo vessel delayed by repairs in Moji. A transport that should be replaced by a number another department cannot provide. One arrival, one loss, 3 postponed, and a footnote. Expect enemy submarine concentrations off the usual points. Expectation that feels less like intelligence and more like a confession of helpless patterns. Outside, Tokyo wears rationing like a second skin. Coal smoke leans against the low sky. Trams tick and squeal. At the piers, stevedores count sacks and marvel at how quickly a hold empties and how slowly another promises to refill. In the training schools, pilots tally hours with a pencil nub and measure competence against a horizon that keeps moving. In fleet anchorage, ships built to stride oceans idle like monuments, their bunkers low, their pointers set at nothing. The impossible number here is a national mood made visible. From roughly 6.38 million gross registered tons at the start of the war, the merchant fleet has shrunk to something like a third of itself by this spring, and the usable fraction is smaller still. Convoying, a right idea deployed late, adds days to every voyage, which reduces what each surviving hull can contribute. Even a perfect day at sea returns too little, too late. Logistics has turned from artery to tourniquet. Hayashi has learned to respect the enemy as an engineer respects a bridge. American submarines, scarcely 2% of their navy, have become the decisive factor in the life of his ledgers. Their skippers hunt where water insists ships will go. Their torpedoes, once troublesome, now detonate as advertised. Their industry makes extravagance disciplined. Fire again, to be sure. If he were a student, he would admire the design. As a servant of a starving enterprise, he only nods and writes harder. He sends an officer to requisition more depth charges from depots that count them like treasure. He drafts a memo pleading for aircraft to cover a stretch of the China coast and receives a polite denial crafted by someone who knows how to tell the truth 5 ways without cruelty. Fuel says no. He underlines a line about night watches and orders extra coffee for soundmen who fight sleep with pride and thin rice. None of it is theatre. All of it is too small for the hole in the bucket. At noon, he meets a merchant captain with hands scarred by rope and worry. The man insists he can make speed enough alone in fair weather. Hayashi wants to bless the bravado, but the arithmetic punishes soloists now. He folds the captain back into the convoy like a father guiding a stubborn son across a street where the light never changes. When he returns to his desk, a fresh report waits. Somewhere east of the Ryukyus, a ship he routed has not reported in. The coordinates are nauseatingly familiar. He does not close his eyes. He writes the proper words because language is the last order he can keep crisp, believed sunk. He moves a pencil line that once promised reinforcements to Okinawa and watches it evaporate under his hand. Strategy shrinks in front of him like a tide going out. Down the hall, someone coughs into a handkerchief and radios hiss like tired cicadas. The city smells of wet wood and regret. Hayashi straightens the ledger and draws a small box around a blank space where a tanker's name should be. He lives in a culture that teaches endurance without complaint. He endures and refrains from complaining. Still, when the day ends, he lets himself sit a moment longer at a window that looks toward a harbour where ships grow fewer each week. The chapter closes on a silence that feels earned more than chosen. Pearl Harbor's briefing room holds the kind of quiet that follows a prayer or a funeral. Admiral Lockwood stands at a final slide that looks simple enough to frame for a den, sectors of a circle, slices of cause. The colour that represents the silent service dominates more than half the pie. It is a picture of a war decided by lanes left empty rather than flags hauled down at gunpoint. He begins without flourish. American submarines, roughly 2% of Navy personnel, have sunk the majority share of Japan's shipping losses by tonnage, on the order of 50+%. The rest belongs to aircraft, mines and surface forces. The room knows these numbers in its bones. Today it says them aloud. Roughly 14,700 torpedoes fired in the Pacific, most in anger, a share wasted by early defects, a far larger share that did exactly what steel and chemistry promised once fixed. He clicks to the line graph that haunted his wall for a year. Merchant tonnage began near 6.38 million gross registered tons. By the end of 1944, the useful fraction is around 2.5 million. By the summer that follows, something like 1.5 to 2.0 million remains, much of it battered or idle. Add in the convoy effect, miles lengthened, schedules compromised, and the delivered freight is less than the hull count admits. Japan did not simply lose ships, it lost time, which is to say it lost choices. A staff officer outlines tactics that stopped being daring and became doctrine. Night surface attacks that treated a fleet boat like a small destroyer. SJ radar that turned storms into cloaks. The TDC that made trigonometry a muscle memory. Mark 14Es that finally kept depth and detonated. Mark 18Es that whispered their way to work. Wolf packs that met in time, hunted funnels, and took tankers first, because fuel is the argument that settles every other argument. He does not pretend the victory was sterile. 52 American submarines did not return. Their names are spoken without shortening. Every ship sunk carried families inside the steel. Yet the moral mathematics endure. To deny an empire the fuel and freights that would have sent more men to more beaches is to shorten the war and save lives on every shore. The paradox is not a riddle to the men in this room. It is the price of doing the job once and doing it right. Somewhere a skeptic will insist that Midway and the Philippine Sea decided everything, and Lockwood does not argue. He reframes. Those carrier battles killed the enemy's ability to win decisively. The submarine campaign killed the enemy's ability to try. By 1945, a decisive fleet action cannot occur because the fuel to mount it never arrives. Training hours vanish, escorts thin, convoys creep, factories miss the output that ships were supposed to feed. Strategy becomes the management of absence. He allows one impossible comparison because it teaches cleanly. American yards launched more Liberty and Victory ships than Japan possessed in merchant tonnage at the start. Add hundreds of T2 tankers, and the ratio looks like an error on a blackboard. The result at sea is an enemy that must husband torpedoes and depth charges the way a poor man budgets meals, while American skippers can fire again to guarantee a kill. It isn't profligacy, it's doctrine made of factories. In a corner, a yeoman flips through a list of JANAC attributions that reduce heroism to attribution and still manage to honour it. Named ships, positions, dates, tonnage. The clerk's pencil squeaks, a chief's shoe leather creaks. The physics of the room are honest, relief and grief leaning on each other without apology. When the briefing ends, no one claps. Caps go on. Men go back to work that feels lighter and heavier at once. Outside, the piers hold a few boats with flags at half-mast and many with chipped paint that will soon be sanded in peace. The silent service has always disliked parades. It prefers the old sailor's benediction, home again, well done, sleep now. The decisive battle that never came will never fill a painting, but it will fill ledgers, histories, and empty lanes on the map. That absence is the victory. The chapter ends on an image a novelist would envy for its economy. A chart with a line that dives and another that climbs, a pie where one colour owns more than half of the circle, a shoreline where wives and mothers count heads and this time win. The war is almost over, and the future has already begun to move into the space the submarines created by subtraction. Grey water, grey sky, September 2nd, 1945. Ships lie at anchor like punctuation marks, ending a sentence the world has been writing for 4 years. Far beyond the clustered dignity of battleships and flags, a periscope feather rises and slides away, habit surviving victory. In the harbour, a generation of uniforms gathers under authority and humility. Papers wait to be signed, faces wait to believe what the paper will say. On a pier miles and lifetimes away, Ruth McKenna wipes welding dust from her cheek with a gloved hand and reads the headline in a paper that rustles like a ship's hull at speed. The tankers and liberties she helped send to sea now line docks in distant ports, their cargoes already shifted from war to a peacetime hungry for steel and bread. She has learned that numbers can make music, more hulls than the enemy ever owned, more fuel than the enemy could dream of moving, more choices than the enemy could finance. In Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Hayashi signs a final memo that will never be sent and closes a ledger that turned from schedule to epitaph months ago. He has done his duty and watched the calendar do more. He steps into a corridor that smells of wet paper and worn wood and bows to a colleague because courtesy outlives catastrophe. He wonders who will teach young officers to love convoys first, and then he smiles at the absurdity of planning a doctrine for a navy that must now begin with humility. At Pearl, Admiral Lockwood dictates a message to his force that sounds like a salutation and a farewell. He chooses plain words because the men who went down deserve nouns without varnish. He thanks the boats that came home and names the boats that did not. He permits himself one line of pride he would normally swallow. The war on shipping, judged by post-war boards and veterans' eyes alike, proved perhaps the decisive factor in the enemy's economic collapse. It is a sentence that has been earned. Commander Richard O'Kane, alive by skill and mercy, stands at a rail and feels the particular ache that victory opens. He imagines faces, not silhouettes. Tang is a word on a plaque, and also a pressure on the chest that doesn't lift when the band plays. He knows what the statistics mean because he helped write them with a pencil that shook and a torpedo room that hummed. He will spend years telling the story carefully, so that people understand how courage and system learned to pull in the same direction. The impossible idea that governed the war now reads like common sense in hindsight. A free nation, organized and equipped, can marshal more production in a month than a militarized empire can in a year. It can arm a 2% cadre to strangle an ocean. It can treat abundance not as excess, but as strategy. The submarines did what they did because women like Ruth built what they sailed, and because officers like Lockwood turned complaints into engineering and doctrine. The enemy did not lose for lack of bravery. He lost for lack of tomorrow. Sailors on the anchorage's edges swap Hershey bars with Allied guards and grin the grin of men who have just remembered they are young. A chief counts his crew without moving his lips. A chaplain prays in a voice hard to hear and impossible to mistake. Up the bay, civilians stare at grey ships with a fear that is part awe and part exhaustion. Peace feels like a ship easing alongside, inevitable and still surprising. The documents are signed, flags move as if exhaling, the gulls return to ordinary work. Out to sea, lanes lie empty because they belong to someone now who keeps them that way without saying so. Factories will cool, then hum again in peacetime gears. Not all stories get endings this clean, but this one has earned clarity. The merchant fleet that began the war has mostly become a chart of wreck symbols and a lesson plan. The camera in the mind pulls back. You see Rasher in rain, Sturgeon's spread, Wahoo's gamble, Tang's last breath counted through a rubber lung, Hayashi's pencil hovering over a blank that refused to become a ship, Ruth's hand steady on a seam, Lockwood's finger on a diving line. Then the lens widens to the scale that makes people whisper, millions of tons erased, roughly half by boats crewed by a sliver of the Navy, torpedoes fired in their tens of thousands, shipyards answering with more. If you listen hard, you can almost hear the bronze cams of a torpedo computer ticking in a museum somewhere, patient as a metronome. The rhythm is the same one that carried us from storm-lashed bridges to quiet lanes, from scarcity to doctrine to victory. The last image deserves stillness, grey water smoothing under a small wake where a periscope has just dipped, the ocean at rest because free hands kept their grip. We inherit that quiet, along with the duty to remember how it was made,